Welcome to my how to play Twin Rivers in a team game tutorial. This video is going to cover the Airlock first and then the Lancelot. I think it's important for each of you to understand both slots, not only because you will have to cooperate with your teammate on the other slot. Twin Rivers is a very team play intense map, but also because you will face opponents who play on both slots, and knowing how to defend against either is knowledge that comes from knowing how these slots work. Now let us start with the Airlock build order. You want to go modified Hydro Rush, meaning your ACU constructs the land factory and one power generator and 3 mixes. The closest mass extractor to your factory is going to get built by the first engineer the factory constructs. And the reason for this modification, despite the Hydro being relatively close, is that you need this extra power generator to dual assist your ACU in the construction of the Hydro and the pigeons. If you don't have this power generator but just open with 4 mass extractors after the land factory, then you will power stall as 2 engineers are assisting your ACU in the construction of pigeons after the Hydro completes. And you want to avoid this. So first 2 engineers headed to the Hydro, start constructing the Hydro. ACU is going to join and assist, and these NGs will also construct a total of 8 power generators and 2 air factories. The first air factory midway through the pigeons, and then the other pigeons follow, and the next air factory. Engine number 3 is going to expand to the 2 mass extractors at the front. Now, Twin Rivers has a meta, but not everybody knows it. So to some LAN players, it may be intuitive that the 2 mixes in front of the air player's base belong to 1 LAN player each, because they're actually closer to the LAN players than to the air player. But it doesn't make sense to play air on 6 mixes if you don't get any of the islands. And it doesn't really matter for a LAN player if they have like 8, 9 or 10 mixes, right? So it's important that the air player gets them. And in case there's any confusion, you should tell your LAN players up front that you're going to build these mixes. And if they start discussing, well, just point out that you can't play air on 6 mixes. The remaining engineers are going to reclaim. There are some large rocks at your hill behind the base, and also small rocks on the small hill on the bottom right, and there's another hill top left, which also has some rocks. Manual reclaim is very important on Twin Rivers because there is not a lot of reclaim overall, and the trees are not very good. They don't come in groups, which means they take a long time to reclaim individually, and they don't give as much power and mass as you would expect. So make sure you pick those rocks over the trees and prioritize them by using manual reclaim. So why the 2 air factories and so many pigeons and so many assisting engineers? Well, this is an Airlock build, and Airlock is about building a scout that patrols around the enemy base and spots enemy aircraft. So this can be enemy scouts, interceptors, bombers, or transports, and you pretty much want to shoot down anything they build with your own interceptors. So the scout, rather than just identifying what the enemy is doing, functions as a spotter for enemy aircraft that allows you to shoot them down. If your opponent opens transport first, the Airlock is going to allow you to shoot down the transport, and you can build your own transport while your opponent is still recovering from losing the transport and catching up in the air game by building inties. And if your opponent also opens Airlock, then having the 2 factory heavily assisted Airlock is going to allow you to outscale their Airlock. This is why there are so many pigeons, so many assisting engineers, and 2 air factories instead of just 1. Of course, you can't miss the enemy aircraft, so don't go Airlock and then let the inties patrol and never shoot down any target. Perhaps your inties will even die to enemy stationary anti-air if you aren't careful. Well, if your opponent builds that, just retreat your inties a bit and make sure they still circle around the enemy base, but they don't get hit by the flak. This will increase the size of your perimeter, so it's easier for your opponent to break through the Airlock, since it only requires a defeat in detail force that you know, punctuates the perimeter in a certain spot rather than outscaling the whole thing. A local majority is enough. You don't have to have like a global majority in fighters, sort of. But the Airlock is still going to be in effect for quite a while, since you have that production lead which you can serve. Now, when you shoot down enemy aircraft and there's pretty much no chance your opponent is going to recover from the lost air control in the next couple of minutes, you should build your own transport, and you should drop on one of the islands. Usually, land players make an attempt on Twin Rivers to get the islands themselves. They can either make their own transport, which is extremely risky because they're going to have 2 or 3 land factories less compared to somebody who doesn't do that. Or, more commonly, they cliff build, meaning they send their first engine to the shore and try to construct a land factory across the cliff. And if land players cliff build, well, if it's an opponent, make sure you scout that and bomb the NG. And if it's your own land player, you would obviously try to drop an island where there's no ally cliff build going on. Because what's important is that your team has 2 islands. 2 islands are like an extra base on Twin Rivers. They have so many mixes and so much reclaim. And you don't have a lot in your home base, so it's really like having an extra player eco-wise. So make sure your team gets both islands, and if there is a free island or a contested island, don't take the island your ally already like, cliff builds on, right? Should be intuitive, but I'm still saying it because I've seen people drop an island that was already taken by their friend, and that just didn't make any sense. So having 2 islands pretty much guarantees that you win the game. I haven't seen many games in which a team had 2 islands and lost the game. That's about the same as a throw on Twin Rivers. If you play somewhat carefully and you have 2 islands, there's no way you lose, pretty much. So you should really prioritize getting the islands. This is also the reason why there hasn't been many mass extractor upgrades. Just 1 so far, while the transport was filling. You can see how that makes sense, because you have tons of pigeons in your base and you don't have engineers because your engineers are in the transport headed to the island. And when you don't have build power, you might as well use the build power of the T1 mass extractor in the upgrade to T2 to make use of the resources you still have, since your NGs obviously can't build anything while they're in the transport. So this is how you time your mass extractor upgrade. And about, well, any other mass extractor upgrade, you would make sure you have the islands, which is way more important than mass extractor upgrades. 4 mass extractors on the islands are better than 1 mass extractor upgrade in the base. 4 mass extractors on the island are better than 1 mass extractor upgrade on the base, just in case I said upgrade before. And it's also cheaper to get the islands usually. Plus you deny them to your opponent, so islands it is. Way, way, way more important than mixes. Of course you still eco later, and you go T2 air. These are all good things to do on Twin Rivers, but there's a cheaper way of having more battlefield impact, and that is getting gun ACU. So if you send your ACU to the front as the air player, that creates a 2 versus 1 situation typically, and by the time your enemy air player realizes, you might have already killed the opponent of your land player. So I highly recommend doing that. And you can use the power you have been overbuilding from the airlock, add just a little bit more power, get your power storage, and then you can upgrade both guns as Aeon or, well, any gun of other factions, and then you're gonna be good and you can double team that guy. Twin Rivers is a map where inexpensive snipes work out great, so going for risky things like risky but inexpensive things like TML and the Ghetto Gunship and Mercies is great because you don't have a lot of mixes, so you might as well take the risk and either it works or it doesn't. But going for like large scale T2 gunships is relatively expensive. You can totally do that when you have both islands and you don't want to spend your eco on anything other than a snipe. Then going large scale T2 gunships works great, but without the islands I don't recommend it. So in this simulation, I'll assume I have the islands, and that's why I go for swift wins and later gunships, but this may not always be the case. And when you are on low eco, go for the more risky but less expensive snipe weapons. Gun ACU being the prime example, because you invest power and mass once, and then for the rest of the game it only spends power to operate, and you no longer have to build anything with the ACU. You can just get kills by, well, shooting overcharge power and just having it vet by having it kill tanks. On the islands later on you can get T2 land. This is primarily to make TMD there, but if you're fast about it, you can of course make TML at the edge of the cliff, and you can TML the mixes of the guy you're pressuring or your teammate is pressuring. And any non-Aeon faction can drop T2 tanks. Aeon should go T3 if they want to drop high-tech units, otherwise T1 RD drops are perfectly fine. So I hope this little introduction into the Twin Rivers air slot has helped, and I'm hoping this is going to make your Twin Rivers experience better. Moving on to the Twin Rivers Lancelot, I feel like this opening is going to be quite counterintuitive to some people. This is because Twin Rivers is a map with middle mass, and if there is middle mass, people typically send their first engineer along with some protection to get it and tie it into their build. But on Twin Rivers, I feel like the island is more important. So you would send your first engineer across the water to the beach and cliff build at the closest possible point. The engineer is going to build a factory on top of the island, which in turn builds more engineers, tanks, anti-air, and well, you would construct radar there as well. And this is how you manage to claim and hold the island. It's actually your second engineer which heads to the middle. It's going to be late, but you send 2 tanks with it. So if your opponent sends their first engineer to middle, your tanks can kill it quickly. And most people protect their engineer. Some send a tank and a lab, some just send a tank. And well, everybody has a scout usually. But in any case, if you have 2 tanks and a scout, you can destroy 1 scout, 1 tank and a lab, which is the most that other people typically send on this map. So you're going to get the middle mass. You're just going to get it a little bit later because the island is more important. If the scout spots incoming raids, then you would retreat your engineer and maybe build one of the mixes on the way. Let the tanks catch up and deal with the problem. Now this first engineer is unprotected, and this is because in the current meta game, people haven't quite realized yet how good the island is, and that land players can quite inexpensively claim the island by sending their first engineer there. So of course, when the meta game develops, my bad, couldn't decide between evolves and develops. When it develops, you would of course protect this engineer, like you would protect the first one. Maybe later on when people start killing your engineer with a lab or a tank, you would send your tanks to the first engineer instead of the second one. They can hardly kill both, and if they do, well, just build 2 tanks and send 1 tank to each and micro a bit. The next 2 engineers you're going to build will assist the ACU in the construction of power generators and factories. So note that this is not your standard second land build with 5 power generators before the factory, because engineers will assist it, and these engineers consume power. So you want to have at least 1 extra power generator before the second factory. And I'm going to build a total of 13 power generators before factory number 3. This is because I'm now dual assisting my ACU, so 2 engineers are assisting it, and these cost power. And also because I'm going to build a relatively fast power storage, and I want to get gun upgrade relatively quickly. And to afford all that, I of course need a lot of power. The next couple of engineers, I think 3 or 4 of them, are going to build mixes around my base and reclaim some mass. and all engineers that follow will assist the engineers that are currently assisting the ACU. When my mass is going to be low, the ACU will of course leave the base to not stall, and also to inflict some map control function at the front. And this engineer that's headed to the two mexes on the way to the hill can construct those mexes and later on get PD and radar. And behind the safety of the PD, your ACU can upgrade. And you would get the gun upgrade to pressure your opponent quickly, because spam and gun synergize quite well. On a map that is as low mass as Twin Rivers, you would not get T2 usually, unless you specifically want to rush TML. Because if you have to continuously build PD to have battlefield impact, and that's of course going to waste a lot of mass. And this PD cannot move, so if you want to creep into the enemy base, you would have to, well, essentially destruct the point defense that's in the back to afford the one that's in the front. And I feel like this is just too slow, and you could always get like flanked and stuff, right? So gun upgrade is the more economic way of fighting on Twin Rivers, because you have the potential to get a lot of power, but you don't really have the potential to get a lot of mass income. Once the eco boost from the island starts kicking in, so that's of course not now because none of the mexes are built, none of the mass is reclaimed, but once that happens, you would upgrade one of your factories to T2 or upgrade T2 mass extractors. So if your opponent is getting TML and it gets scouted, you would of course get your T2 factory before getting mass extractor upgrades. But if you realize that your opponent is relatively slow with their T2, be it factory T2 or an ACU T2 for fast TML, you of course have more time to eco before you have to get your own T2. So depending on that, you may delay or speed up your T2 factory and just use the mass for taking up mass extractors instead. That's always an option. It's better to have slightly later T2 land and instead have larger scale T2 land, because after upgrading your HQ to T2, you will of course build an engineer and assist it with T1 engineers in the construction of TMD and the T2 power generator. And perhaps you would get T2 radar next to the hill, maybe even shielded by like a power shield. But you would also upgrade the additional factories, support factories, to T2. And your factories in the base should go T2 for sure, to just increase the scale of your unit production. And well, to speed up this process as well, you can make one T2 land factory that spams engineers after you have some eco from the island. And the engineers from this factory can assist your HQ in the upgrade, and also later on the support factories in the upgrade. And you can also build extra T1 land factories for artillery and some T1 anti-air. This is how your main factories can focus on pillars and power shields entirely and won't waste time constructing T1 RD in the mix. You do need the T1 RD because pillars are very tanky, your ACU is tanky, and you just need some damage dealers to round this mix pretty much. You can get a T2 support factory on the island as well. This can make a tactic missile launcher and TML the enemy side of the map if you build it at the very tip of the island. And you can also get some tanks on that island to drop them in the enemy base, either your opponent's base on the flank or the air player. You can ask your own air player for T2 transports to get the drops, but you can of course also get your own air. And if you see that your opponent is prioritizing a T3, like he is not staying on the T2 stage, but trying to get many engineers assisting the HQ on the way to T3, perhaps because he's Aeon or because he's Siren and doesn't want to build Rhinos, then you can always make some Janus or well, another faction's T2 bomber to kill the engineers that are trying to get the factory upgrade or take out the T2 Pigeon. So let me maybe just give you some final tips to conclude this tutorial. You would always keep in mind that 1 versus 2 or 2 versus 1 situations are common on Twin Rivers because the air player is going to join the battle of the land players, either just with the ACU or also with quite aggressive air snipes. And because of that, the deaths are common as well. So get ready to kill your opponent. Get ready to defend your ally. Make sure that you coordinate with your teammate, and you always like get into a stage where you have to claim an enemy base or reclaim an allied base. And if that happens, you need to get extra engineers and extra power generators to tie that mass you're reclaiming into your setup and to immediately scale up your unit production once the eco boost kicks in. Now, sometimes you notice that your teammates on Twin Rivers are not following the strategy of your team. And well, if they're playing well on their own, that may not be a problem. But when you notice that they play poorly and they still won't listen to what you have to say or what your teammates have to say, and they just won't coordinate at all, don't be afraid to confront them about it. And if nothing else helps, you can foe them and just try not to play with them again. Because Twin Rivers is a map where team play is even more necessary than in other team maps, I feel. And well, this map has an adaptive version as well. Depending on the exact settings, there is a possibility that the islands are taken from the very start. And with more players, it usually happens that 1 versus 2 or 2 versus 1 situations are not so quick to tip. So when I'm just saying the game is going to be more balanced with more people, regardless of whether the islands are going to be equally distributed because people spawn on the islands or because there's more people trying to go for the same island, and that's why both teams get one island. And because of these double teaming situations that don't happen as much with more players, or at least it's easier to recover from them with more players, the game is just going to be longer. And when you know that the game is going to be longer, you would of course eco a bit more compared to a game with less players, where double teaming is very important and where these efficient snipes and aggressive openings work out best. And lastly, keep in mind that the build orders I have demonstrated here are not the only ones you can use on Twin Rivers. Perhaps you are going to encounter an air player who goes for a first air fast transport that outspeeds your airlock. Or perhaps you encounter some quick TML build order. So don't be afraid to experiment. And I guess subscribe for more. And see you on the battlefield.